welcome to this poster presentation event. My name is Richard, and I organized a directed reading on historical syntax this semester for our master students. And during this course, we investigated the development of the verb fear in the history of English. And it is now my great pleasure to introduce the MA students who worked on this topic and who will present their research findings in this format. First, we will hear Michael. Michael received his undergraduate degree in linguistics from the University of Lancaster, and he will continue his postgraduate studies here in Manchester as a PhD student working on non-finite complements in Estonian. Afterwards, Xinyi will present her results. She graduated from Guangdong University of Foreign Studies in English Education, and she is considering doing a PhD in a corpus linguistics related area afterwards. Next, we will listen to Lindsay. Lindsay has a degree in linguistics from the University of Sydney in Australia. And after her MA, she is going to look for a job. Yu Chen will follow after that. Yu Chen graduated from Tianjin Foreign Studies University in English Translation Interpretation. And she is, as of yet, undecided as to what she wants to do afterwards. Our fifth presenter will be Konstantinos. Konstantinos has been a true Mancunian since 2010. He has done all of his studies with us. First a BA in English language and now an MA in linguistics. And in the future, he might look for a job in a computational field. The final research talk will be given by Vashini. Vashini has a BA in English and Communication from Raj College in southern India. And afterwards, she would like to continue her higher studies in a field such as, for instance, international relations or maybe speech and language processing. Yeah, enjoy.
The English verb to fear originally had an argument structure which put the stimulus in the subject position and the experiencer in the object position, as in example one, where we have Marvels feared the Romans, which translates into the modern form as the Marvels frightened. Sometime during the 11th and 17th centuries, this changed around to the modern argument structure, where the experiencer is the subject and the stimulus is the object. We also have a third example, that's an intermediate example of a reflexive construction, where the stimulus is an object alongside the reflexive experience. And so the aim of the study is to find out the date of innovation and propagation of this change. We took our data from a custom-made corpus of late medieval English texts, ranging from 1350 to 1550, and a sample size of around 3.5 million. We targeted text strings of various spellings of the verb to fear, using outcode. We put that all onto a database and then recoded each line manually for the conservative, the innovative, and the reflexive structures. We then took that data and put it into a custom R script, which built a logistic regression model of the first model, which is in red in figure 1, is the proportion of new uses out of the new argument structures out of instances of the verb fear over time. The model predicts that it took around 328 years between 1266 and 1594 for the change to take place, although the confidence intervals suggest that this could be anywhere between 244 and 450 years. For the second model, for the reflexive construction, we did a similar thing, the reflexive argument here, except because we know subsequently the sequence, that indicates of the squared to ensure that there was a single inflection point in the model. Now, this always remains a minority throughout our sample period, and it peaks sometime afterwards. So, fear resembles other contemporary dating experience of verbs, which has lost their impersonal argument structure, such as enjoy, think, or like. This is possibly a semantic bleaching of the pre-verbal slot, because the number of semantic roles that can go in that pre-verbal slot has increased. This could have been a push chain due to the emergence of other verbs such as terrorise or frighten, which took up this causative meaning, and then fear lost its causative meaning and took up the non-causative meaning. And then the reflexive structure, for the majority of the time, the overwhelming majority of the time, in fact, it's in the first person. It seems that it fulfills a specific function, and that could be a precursor to the modern epistemic particle, I fear. So in conclusion, we've got innovation in the late 12th to early 13th centuries and completion in the late 16th to early 17th centuries.
Okay, thanks, Michael. As the argument structure of the verb fear changed, the past participle was also affected. We can see the table here. Feared in old argument structure means to feel fear. Like he is feared means he is afraid. While in new argument structure, feared means to cause fear. Like death is feared means death causes fear. As we all know that nowadays we use afraid to express that I feel fear. But in Middle and early modern English, feared, afeared, and afraid all existed in Middle and modern early English. There are some examples here. But yet the knights were feared and dared not go over. They were afeared and ran away. They were afraid, unsurprisingly. So in this research, I will measure the rate and time course of the substitution of afeared with afraid. And then I will discuss some implications based on the results. To conduct the study, I used a custom-made corpus, which is the same as Michael's. And I used nconc to search for strings targeting feared, afeared, and afraid. The search queries are as follows because there are many spelling variants in Middle and early modern English. After calling all the examples and deleting all the false hits, I got 345 examples altogether in the final dataset. Then I used logistic regression to model the change, and I get this graph. The results show that the proportion of afraid has been increasing over time during this period, and it would take roughly 700 years for the replacement to complete, which means there are 99% of examples would use afraid after these years. Then I'd like to discuss some of the results here. First, the change seems to be very slow, roughly 700 years, and the reasons might be measurement error or outliner texts. For example, the text prosmarine, which presented as a data point here. It uses a much higher proportion of afraid compared to its time. And because it is big, which means that it contains a lot of examples. So it imposes a very big influence on the rate of change. It drags the line up and makes the line much flatter. According to Cross and Helen's work, the text might rather be representative of mid-15th century English, but the text prosmarine was dated 1420. Probably the data was wrong, but it might also be related to the dialect thing. Because prosmarine represents a northern dialect. Probably the northern dialect was much more innovative at that time. Second, if the timing of the substitution process is correct, it would mean that afraid may have entered the language before afeared acquired its new argument structure. What I mean is that first, afraid was introduced, and the introduction of afraid may influence the change in the argument structure in past participles, and then the change in past participles may also change the verb, which is different from the first claim that the change in the verb also affected the past participle. I mean, both could be possible, but further research might be needed. Third one, past participle fear changes in meaning from afraid to positive fear, which I mentioned before. The examples as follow. Huang was so feared that there was no one so hard to dare approach him, and rulers are to be feared. But there are only 20 hits in the dataset, so my next step should be to expand the dataset. And I would also explore the role of dialect, genre, and translation, which might influence the results. Third, to separate a feared from feared, and to investigate the role of a feared, like what might be the function of the prefix a, and what's the relationship between feared and afraid. I mean, they are quite similar. To conclude, the words afeared and afraid coexisted roughly from 1350 to 1600. During the period, afraid gradually replaced other two forms, but this was a very slow process. The replacement seems to be connected to the change in the argument structure, but further research might be needed to find the precise nature between the two, and that's on my research. Thank you. Yes, and the data given from 1315 to 1550. What might be the situation after 50-50? Then I will give a stage to Lindsay and her research.
Hi, I work on the polarity of the verb fear and its complementation in 16th century English. Introduction. Iyeiri claims that there was a correlation between the polarity of fear and its complementation pattern. 1a, affirmative fear followed by a finite complement. I fear that deity has stolen him, hence that such his destiny. And 1b, affirmative fear but followed by a non-finite complement. I fear to be damned for evermore. And 2b, negative fear, fear not, and it's followed by a non-finite complement, that they fear not to do any kind of harm. And 2b, negative fear, and followed by a finite complement, not fear, danger, that therefore. In figure 1, we can say the diagonal strapped bar is finite complement, and the black bar is non-finite complement. So in affirmative fear, the diagonal strap bar is taller than black bar. And in negative fear, the black bar is taller than the diagonal strap bar. So the finite clauses are typically used to complement positive fear, while non-finite clauses generally complement negative fear. And additionally, affirmative sentences with fear are overall more frequently than negative sentences with fear. And Iyeiri originally had a couple of limitations. For instance, she didn't have any examples of negative fear, and she didn't give any statistical analysis, and her data size is small. And in methodology, I compared a corpus of 16th century dramas with texts collected from early modern English drama and the database of early English playbooks. And the corpus contains 95 texts and approximately 1.7 million words. And I used encount searching for fear to find all hints of the word fear in the material. Then I coded pos and neg for polarity. Pos is positive and neg is negative. And fin and nfin for complementation pattern. Fin is 1a and 2b. Nfin is 1b and 2a. And all irrelevant example coded as x. And they could be nouns, adjectives, and they could be anything totally different. And the final dataset contains 275 examples. And let's move on the results. The results are presented in figure 2. Non-finite complement shows in blue and appears significantly more frequent than negative than after positive fear. And we can say the orange bar is taller than this blue bar, and this orange bar is shorter than this blue bar. And the effect is very large, as shown by the fact that the odds of finding a non-finite complement after negative fear. And we can say this blue bar versus this orange bar are 17 times higher than this blue bar versus this orange bar. So these results replicate precisely the claims made by Iyeiri. And let's discuss the results. It is possible that fear not 2 was represented as a single unit in 16th century English. And as due support developed into the pattern do not fear, as in for, the string fear not to dies out. And my data set is only one example of due support with negative fear and followed by that causes. And the second discussion is, since the data is based on the grammatic text, there may be stylistic reasons for the use of non-finite complement. For example, they may produce a good flow of rhythm for the voice as in 5. Since who is feared still fears to be so feared. If turns this sentence into that causes, since who is feared still fears that he be so feared, and the rhythm will be broken. And the last discussion is, it is likely that the complement of fear is influenced by form. Fear plus in may be more likely to be followed by to do, as in 6, and the substantial occurrence of positive fear followed by non-finite complements will depend on the structure appearing in the corpus. In conclusion, I replicate Iyeri's findings, roughly doubling her sample size. And her sample size has roughly 120 examples, and I have 270 examples. And presenting a statistical analysis and focusing on one genre and discussing individual examples. And there are a bunch of questions. One of them is, how do positive and negative fear with finite and non-finite complement clauses develop after the 16th century? And another question is that the complementary distribution of complement clauses after positive and negative fear exists in other genres like 16th century treatise text. And Yu Chen will talk about the development of fear in 17th century English.
Hi, my research is in the 17th century, which is the early modern English period. It studies the rise of the support with the word fear. For example, it's a variation from I feel not to I do not fear. Particularly, my research is from an individual perspective. It studies how different authors in the corpus differ in this development. So I got two research questions here. First, I'll compare the rise of the support with the word fear to think and doubt to see if the word fear rises at a typical rate of change. And then second, I will try to figure out whether the traits of different authors go with population trait over their lifespan. For the study, I select 12 authors out of 50 authors from the early modern multiloquent authors, also called Emma corpus. You can see they are from 3 generations. Each generation has 4 authors. I list all the names of them and also years of birth and death. So these are the 12 authors I use. For the data collection part, I extract do and no do, for example, not fear and fear not, of all forms of fear, think, and doubt, using @conc. And then I delete the falsities and correct them manually. After correcting them, I put the data in R using the logistic regression model. Here is the first result. In this figure, we can see fear is the reference value, which is the red line. And if you compare it to the blue line think, you can see they are quite different. Think has a higher probability of do support than fear. But if you compare it to the green line, you can see they are quite similar. These two lines are almost overlapped. And then comes the second result. In this figure, there are 10 lines which indicate the rise of the support of 10 authors. I mentioned that I select 12 authors, but 2 of them is this Samuel Clarke and Giles Jacob. They don't have enough data, so the model cannot be repetitive. So in this figure, you can see 6 of them don't show enough evidence of change. You can see lines like this are very flat. And 3 of them go with population trend. Is this one, Jeremy Taylor, and this one, Edward Stillingfleet, and also this one, Gilbert Bernard. And also we got one person who goes against population trend. It's this red line, Daniel Wisby. So these are the results for the word type effect and for the individuals. And now I'll discuss the results. So from the first figure, we can know that word lemma is very important. Different words have different base probabilities of the support. And but in this research, I only take year as the independent variable, because when we study the rise of the support, the word type effect is the most important one to consider. Also, when we look at the first figure, we can know that fear has a small sample size compared with the other two words. Like it only has 180 samples, but think and doubt have about 800 samples. Even they have 800 samples, they are not still not enough. So it's very hard to see the variation only through one single word fear. And it's also the reason why when I compare the individuals in the second figure, I combine three words together to see the variation of each other, because there are few samples if I only look at fear. And also, when we look at the second figure, we may notice there is one person, Gilbert Burnett, this line. He has a very strong and fast development. So why is that? I try to relate his use of the suppose with his biography. I find that he was Scottish, but he moved to London later and published book there. So I assume that maybe because he wanted to integrate himself into London society, or maybe because he wanted to make his work more accessible to more audience. This could be causes why he might have a more radical development than other authors. And in conclusion, it can be observed that the word fear rises at the same time with other words. And also we can know that the traits of some individuals go with the population trait. And in the future study, in my dissertation, I will collect more words, also from more authors, to increase the sample size, and I may have a better understanding of the current study. And then Konstantinos will continue to introduce the development of fear over the next 200 years.
Hi, I looked at how the decline of fear in the 18th to 20th centuries may have led to an increase in the realization of an overt rat complementizer. Research has shown that the prevalence of the verb may influence whether it requires a complementizer. For example, a more frequent verb like guess occurs 1% of the time with an overt rat, whereas a less frequent verb like worry occurs 75% of the times with an overt rat. Iyeiri in 2009 observed an increase in the realization of an overt rat in the complement clause after fear, as we can see here in table 1. Fear occurred 16% of the time with an overt rat in the 18th century, and this increased to 32% in the 19th century, and then 51% in the 20th century. So, based on this evidence, we might expect that a decline in the frequency of fear in the 18th to 20th centuries, because if a verb occurs more frequently with an overt rat, it is a less frequent verb. So this is my research. I looked at whether the late modern English increase in that can be replicated and measure if fear has in fact become less frequent at the same time. And this hypothesis of an inverse relationship between the frequency and that complementation of fear is illustrated in figure 1. If the proportion of overt rat increases, the relative frequency of fear decreases. And for this research, I used the 34 million word corpus of late modern English texts, which is approximately gender balanced and features texts by British authors and covers the period 1710 to 1920, divided into 70-year subperiods. And I used Danko to search for all the instances of the verb fear and to create a dataset which included 4,195 examples. And these were manually coded for complementation type. The two variables that I'm interested in with that is with an overt that, as in 1, I fear that he is much hurt. Without that in 2, as in I fear he is wounded dangerously. And other complementation patterns, such as nominal complements, as in 3, I fear her subtle mind. And infinitival complements, as in I fear doing something, I fear to do something, as in 4 and 5. He need not fear doing well. It was almost as if a hand and heart feared to be asked for something. And X for false kids and so forth, anything else. And the results of this research were as follows. A logistic regression model of the proportion of that versus no that across time indicates a significant increase in the of overt rat complementation, you can see in the red line. And this replicates Iyeiri's findings. And at the same time, a local regression of the relative frequency of fear against time shows a decrease from circa 2 to 1.5 occurrences per 10,000 words. As you can see here, there's a dip around 1825. And this is compatible with the assertion that fear has become less frequent during this period. And as well, this evidence is compatible with the relationship between the frequency of fear and the likelihood of overt complementizers. However, there are some problems with this research. If it is true, the effect is very small, as we can see here. Between 1825 and 1900, there's only a 10% increase in overt complementation, and the decline in frequency of fear is very slight. And we also observe a wave-shaped curve rather than an S-shaped curve as we would expect. So maybe that's an effect of outliers. There are large uncertainties, as we can see in the relative frequency of fear, so that's also an issue. And we can ask why is there a sudden drop in frequency around 1825. Maybe it's related to some other thing, like a decline in loss of parenthetical fear. And also it is unlikely that in this period there is a 0% overt implementation, so that might be a sampling bias or something wrong with our sample. And we also have to consider that it might just be a correlation, not a causation, so the two are unrelated. And these open questions could be answered if you get more data, and perhaps increase the time scale as well. Perform the same experiment with more verbs and see if they follow the same trends. That would and a larger sample would strengthen the safety of the findings. And we could also consider other factors that might be influencing the decline of fear in the first place, as in the loss of parenthetical fear. So I think I'm hungry, I fear I'm hungry, that kind of thing. So in conclusion, Iyeiri's claim of increasing proportion of complement clauses with overt that after fear could be replicated, and concurrently fear became less frequent overall. The two developments are possibly connected, but many problems and open questions remain.
Very well done. So, as Konstantinos posed an open question about the loss of parenthetical fear, in this research, I will try to answer that question by investigating the development of the parenthetical use of the verb fear from 1800 to the present day. Let's go to the introduction. The verb fear originally conveyed lexical meaning as a verb of cognition, emotion, and attitude, as seen in 1. His careful mother feared he would get hurt. Subsequently, it has undergone grammaticalization and developed towards a discourse marker, as seen in 2. I was obliged to hurry. Little Louis is very ill, I fear. Or, I crossed and thwarted the wall, I fear in wantonness. In 1, fear expresses a negative emotion of dread, anxiety, panic. Its subject is third person, singular, and it's placed in the initial position. In 2 and 3, fear expresses a pragmatic stance such as I think, I mean, you know. It sort of softens the intensity of the emotion conveyed in sentence 1, whereas in 2 and 3, it becomes more of a discourse marker. And its subject is first person, it is placed after the complement as in 2, or it's placed within a phrase as in 3. I will refer to fear when it functions as such a discourse marker as its parenthetical use. In this study, I investigated whether the parenthetical use of fear has increased during the 19th or 20th centuries. So for the methodology, I used the 400 million word corpus of historical American English, spanning from 1820 to 2019, comprising a variety of genres such as fiction, non-fiction, newspapers, and magazines. I collected a sample of 5,000 examples with different inflectional forms of the verb fear based on how frequent they are in the corpus, such as fear, feared, fearing, and fears. I manually quoted each example for 2 variables: position, whether it was initial as in 1, or was it elsewhere as in 2 and 3, and first person, it was not as in 1, and it was in, or yes as in 2 and 3. ID sees these variables as indicative of parenthetical use. I encountered some faults, such as where fear was used as a noun, infinitive, or imperative, and I deleted those. And after which I had around 3965 examples. And I used R to conduct logistic regression. And as you can see, the figure 1 illustrates the proportion of parenthetical fear measured as elsewhere versus initial over time. It's evident that there is a significant decline in the use of parenthetical fear from 10% to 2%. There is an outlier in 1878 at 0.6, but it is not plotted here, and this also replicates Iyeiri's claim of a decrease. However, she reports overall higher percentages from 36 to 27. Further, let's move on to figure 2. Here this figure 2 illustrates the development of first-person singular subject versus other subjects from 1820 to 2019. Again, there is a significant decline in first-person subject from 50% to 20%. This further supports Iyeiri's claim of a decrease, but again higher percentages from 76 to 45. The findings suggest that there is a decline in the parenthetical use of fear. Maybe this is the reason why fear has become less common overall in modern English. Also, when did parenthetical use of fear first emerge? The use seems to first increase perhaps about 1800, and then there is a decline. Why are Iyeiri's percentages higher than mine? This could also be a good research. And also, maybe we could target different genres such as old-fashioned TV shows or historical texts. And I have one example from my favorite author, Charlotte Bronte's Jane Eyre, where you see, however, had they been married, they would no doubt by the severity as husbands have made up for their suitors, and so will you, I fear. Position and subject person are used as proxies for parenthetical use. Are there other features that we can use? Maybe null complementizers. And the findings also suggest that only 5.7% were found in the elsewhere position, indicating a minority variant, and thus they may not be comprehensive as indicators of discourse markers. Perhaps the frequency of parenthetical use can be estimated by combining many features into one model. What about plural we fear versus singular I fear? And what about the form of the verb fear? Does it play a role? And it is also worth noting that it's difficult for fears or fearing to appear in the parenthetical function. Yeah. Overall, there is a good reason to assume that the parenthetical use of fear has been in decline over the last 200 years. Maybe this becomes clear from the frequency of elsewhere positions versus first-person subjects. Maybe we can expand our research by investigating different genres, different features, or more defining features, and also a wider type of investigation.
Very good.